Joseph Mallord William Turner was born in May 1775 in Covent Garden. By the time he is born, Covent Garden transformed from a place where the nobility would bring up their families to a market full of brothels, taverns, mobs and mollies. Covent Garden had also become the beating heart of Britain's creative industry, with theatres, artists and the first auction houses. It is in fact in these auction houses that Turner was introduced to the world of art. Turner's father was a wig maker and barber. At the time, wigs were quite in fashion, inspired by the noblemen of Louis XVI's court. Above his shop was a great auction room, and as art was not very familiar to the general public at the time, it was one of the first places where people could find and see fine art in the flesh. By the 18th century, fine art was in fact accessible to the common man only through prints in shop windows of engravers and booksellers. The National Gallery, for instance, was established only in 1824, and the first donation of a private collection to a public gallery was done in 1811. Furthermore, aristocratic collections were dominated by 16th and 17th century Renaissance and Continental art, marginalizing British works. During the 16th and 17th century, the cultural elite had a firm grasp on those few British artists that were fortunate enough to be able to work. As commercial galleries were still to develop, most works were purchased from agents and dealers. Auctioneers started to develop later, changing the way art was seen, bought and enjoyed by a far wider audience than ever before. Turner was born into the hotbed of creativity, money and opportunity that was Britain in the 18th century. Before then, while the rest of Europe enjoyed the Renaissance in the 16th and 17th century, painters in Britain had been largely classed as craftsmen regulated by the worshipful company of painters' stainers. In the 18th century, a number of societies are founded, such as the Society of Artists and the Free Society of Artists, and they started using London auction houses to display their works. By then, the only thing missing was a prestigious drawing school, but they started to emerge as well, with the Royal Academy of Arts being founded in 1768 at the doorsteps of Turner's home. Turner is famous for his early works in watercolor. Until 1780, painters that wanted to use watercolor had to prepare their own paints. Then, in 1782, Messrs. Reeves started manufacturing watercolor cakes ready to use. This revolution allowed young Turner an easy and accessible way to paint his sceneries while he was on the move. In an era where photography still didn't exist, watercolors presented a great and ingenious way for a painter to jot down impressions of a view without having to carry all of the equipment for oil paintings, and without having to return to a specific location. It's an easy and light accessory for a young and voracious painter such as Turner. Turner has not been recorded as being the official apprentice of any one artist of his time. Instead, he liked to work for different engravers and architects, always learning what he could from them. For schooling, his parents sent him to the best and most renowned school for their art classes, but even those proved insufficient for Turner's appetite. On the 11th of October 1789, Turner is accepted at the Royal Academy of Arts' first school, the Plaster School. This gave him a massive degree of social leverage to his already vast talent. He was in fact the youngest exhibitor since the foundation of the Academy, when he exhibited his first works in 1790 at the RA Summer Exhibition. He would continue to be the only student of his cohort to exhibit throughout his career at the RA. His time at the RA was marked by the tensions created from the French Revolution. Pro-revolutionary Jacobites began circulating Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, and within the RA faction began to appear that disturbed the order during lectures. Factions would shout at each other and against the king. After the decapitation of Louis XVI in 1793, William Pitt the Younger, Prime Minister of the UK, expelled the French ambassador, leading to a declaration of war from the French. Following the years of terror in France, pro-revolutionary zeal subsided and was replaced by a feeling of horror and pity. That same winter, Britain suffered a severely bad harvest. Since the situation did not get better by 1795, the government put in place a number of measures and taxes. Among these was a tax on hair powder, which hit Turner's father business really hard. Turner's father started to become Turner's assistant around that time. Turner's forte in his early years was topography, which was considered to be a lowest order of art. There was in fact a hierarchy among artists. Those that mastered the history painting were considered the highest order of artists, followed by those that specialized in portraiture, and concluding with those that focused on landscapes. Engravers were not considered at all. Watercolor was considered lower order of painting than oil painting. Turner was embracing the commercial side of the art world, focusing on engraving and watercoloring and coloring of engravings, since these provided a stable income. This enterprise didn't keep him from pursuing the higher realms of art. Fortunately for him, in 1756, Burke introduced the concept of the sublime. The sublime differs from beauty in that it is not pleasing and calming, but rather evokes a sense of fear, and it brings the viewer closer to God, with views of storms and mountains. This was closely followed in 1768 by William Gilpin's picturesque. The picturesque lays between the beautiful and the sublime. Gilpin argues that since the beautiful and the sublime could easily be lost when translated into paintings, an artist should try to find a balance between the two, a combination of order and roughness. This new mode of painting, the sublime and the picturesque, suited Turner's repertoire of cottages in the countryside, lakes and rivers, views of the city, and later in 1795 he started to include dramatic views of the sea, for which he is so famous for. By 1798, Turner had invested £950 into the Bank of England, a substantial amount for a painter at the time. However, his income depended from two sources: patronage from the aristocracy and the sale of engravings. With patronage from the aristocracy, Turner could demand high prices per piece, but it was also hard to predict when the next piece would be commissioned, and it might have been hard to collect the money once the painting was delivered. Prints and engravings commanded lower prices, but provided a steady income. By the second quarter of the 18th century, London had surpassed Paris as the capital of engravings. These exports, however, slashed by the embargo of the war with France. Turner needed a solution, and aimed at his position as a member of the Royal Academy of Arts. By 1798, a position opened, and Turner wanted it. His personality suddenly changed from reserved to very social. He had to in fact win the endorsement of as many members as possible. The position of member was vital to Turner because it exempted him from paying any taxes. The powerful lobby of the RA secured this with Pitt the Younger when they instituted the new taxes to pay for the war. To his disappointment, he was not chosen as an associate of the RA that year. He would, however, be selected as an associate the next year in 1799. By this time, Turner started to dabble with classical themes in his paintings. Aeneas and the Sibyl is one example of how his patronage from the aristocracy allowed him to express his talent using those themes that were regarded as higher art forms. Although his fame arose from his watercolors and engravings, he will be remembered to this day in most galleries by those paintings that will follow this new trend. Starting with the oil paintings and the classical themes, he will start to depict the social and economical changes in Britain. Two landmark paintings are The Fighting Temeraire and The Rain, Steam and Speed. In the first, Turner depicts the Temeraire being sold for scrap parts. The Temeraire, an iconic ship of the British Navy, from the crucial part it played in the Battle of Trafalgar, is being towed by a modern steamboat, a striking image of the changing times. What is most striking is the style of his paintings. Turner is famous for his cloudy paintings in his later years, which have more in common with the early Impressionist than with the late Romanticist. It is much debated to this day if his last paintings should be considered unfinished, or if he is foreshadowing the arrival of a new genre in painting. Rain, Steam and Speed is a perfect example of this new style. We can barely see the semblance of a train emerging from a cloud of smoke and yellow clouds. Classical themes in his paintings, like in the case of the Fifth Plague of Egypt, were however inspired by the news of the day. Turner was always in tune with what the market was interested in, and leveraged the patriotic zeal of his countrymen. From an early age he could attach to his paintings a famous poem that inspired the painter. He would sketch or paint of these places that were sought of after tourists. In the case of the Fifth Plague of Egypt, it was inspired by Napoleon's army demise in Egypt, where a third of the army fell to disease. Turner didn't only rely on his methods when representing current affairs. As is the case with the Battle of the Nile and most of his naval paintings, he would depict history as it unfolded, always in patriotic light. This last painting is lost, but knowledge of it remains to this day. The war with France ended in 1801, and immediately droves of artists and noblemen flung themselves into Paris in order to view the capital fashion and art. The Louvre was in fact a cardinal visit for every English artist of the time, as it contained a massive collection of the old masters and much more. Turner, however, was not attracted by the old as much as he was by the new. When the border between France and England opened, Turner moved straight through to visit the Alps instead. He was more interested into the sublime visions of the odd than to study old masters at the Louvre. This pioneering decision not to follow the crowd to Paris, but instead to venture into the desolate and dangerous Alps, marked the beginning of Turner's influence on the world. By this time, he's full member of the RA, and his actions and decisions start to ripple through to us today. Although his style can at times be considered of a different time, Turner's morals are a perfect reflection of Georgian London. His relationship to women was very liberal. He never intended to marry, but still appreciated the company of an opposite sex. His relationship to Sarah Danby was an epitome of the time where 25% of the children were illegitimate. However, Danby was a divorcee and relied on a husband's pension. These pensions depended on her not having sexual relations with other men unless remarried. Turner's and Danby's relationship had to remain thus a secret. This libertine attitude lies in stark contrast with the Victorian attitudes during the last years of his life. In fact, when he was found after his death by his friends in a secret townhouse in Chelsea with a woman unmarried under the pseudonym Admiral Booth, it was kept a secret. The changing times demanded this secret was to be kept to avoid any scandal on the possible relationship between the woman and Turner. Any rumor that would damage Turner's name could not be permitted to circulate. This changing attitude towards morals stands to show how much the costume of the times had little impact on old Turner, as much as the vibrant times of his youth had a strong impact on his early life.